So rather than, here's the reframe. We're going to start with a reframe. The reframe here is that rather than self being a thing that is separate from, or a thing that needs to be protected, defended, maintained, and perpetuated, we're going to suggest here that self is an opening. That self is an opening. That self is an opening through which a knowing awareness flows and illuminates all that is known. I'll repeat that. Some of you are writing, and when you read it later, you're going to go, what? Your notes are very meaningful now, but you'll see when you get out of here. Self is an opening through which a knowing awareness flows, illuminating all that is known. Now, if we consider self as an opening, then it's not a thing, it's an opening through which knowledge flows. It's an opening through which awareness illuminates. And as an opening, and what we're going to work with today and next time if you come back and the time after if you're still here, we're going to work with ways to open or to dilate the opening and the space through which awareness flows. And more open conditions, more open ways of knowing produce new ways of being. The self, in its ordinary, conventional way, is a very narrow slit. I'm just being descriptive, I'm not being disparaging. Self, in its ordinary way, is a very narrow slit that focuses on its interests, its concerns, its fears, its desires, its beliefs, in terms of what this is doing to me. That's the me. Or what I think of that. So there's an I, subjective I is the subject, and me as the object, inherent in that narrow slit. So that our ordinary way of seeing is very subjective, in that what we're seeing is my opinion, what I think, what my judgment is, what my feeling is about that. Or what that is doing to me. So there's an I and a me intrinsic to all perception, all ordinary perception. This is the egocentricity of our ordinary ways of perceiving and being in the world. And if we consider that we're all operating through that narrow slit, that self-referencing tendency, we begin to get some clue as to why there's friction, why there's divisiveness, why there's trouble in our times. Trouble in our times, trouble in our families. You know, the division that I spoke of between nations and countries and religions and sects are happening in our own household. Siblings are not talking to each other. Parents and their offspring are at odds. Partners are divided. We're living the existence of a separate, isolated perception and the consequences of that way of knowing. And we've been taught it. This is not This is not our badness or our wrongness. This is what we've been taught. We've been taught. We were born with an open awareness. We were born as awareness. It's through awareness is the how we know. How we know is because of an active awareness. An active awareness allows knowing. We've been taught what to know. So it's the how and the what. And we've been taught our name, we've been taught what's right, we've been taught what's wrong, we've been taught how good we are, we've been taught how bad we are. We've been taught everything we know, we've been taught. However, at the core of everything we know is an active, enlivened awareness. And it's that active, enlivened awareness to be able to access that awareness, the activity of that awareness, the aliveness of that awareness, to recognize that at the core of all experience, is an enlivened, active awareness. And that at the core, our true nature is this awareness. And to be able to recognize awareness as our true and authentic nature. And it's that awareness that illuminates all that is known. And we tend to focus on the things that we know. Now, the content of the mind, that's what we live. We live the content of the mind. The content of the mind is the patterning of awareness. But the presence of the awareness is obscured by this pattern, our attention to the content of our mind. What we know obscures how we know, how knowing occurs at all. And it's that essential exploration of the nature of awareness that is at the root of many meditative traditions, is at the heart of all mystical traditions, and is what we ignore in our daily trials and tribulations by attending to the things, the content of our mind. So our practice here today and next month and the month after will be to open the lens, to open the aperture setting, so that we might appreciate more degrees of freedom. We might appreciate a greater space. We might experience greater clarity. Because we already know the consequences of the narrow aperture setting. And if we play with the idea that we're always perceiving the output or the consequence of a way of knowing, of an aperture setting, and unless we regulate or open that space, we will always know that way. And when we know that way, the output of that way of knowing creates a particular reality, which we then have to deal with and solve. And we try to deal with and solve the problems of that way of knowing with that lens still in place. And that is the cause of our suffering. Say it again, please. Sure. Starting from where? Little back, right? Little back. We're always experiencing the consequence, the output of our setting. the aperture setting reveals a particular reality. The reality and all of the concerns of that reality and the self of that reality. The world that we inhabit and the experience of the self simultaneously are a consequence of a particular focal setting or opening of the lens. As we learn to open the lens, as students, we want to dilate the pupil so that the eye can see another way. As we open our way of knowing, we can experience another way of being that has more freedom, more light, more clarity, more space. And we can learn to live with greater ease, greater comfort, less reactivity. Is there anyone here who would not want to be less reactive? So we're all on the same page, right? I don't have to keep telling us the consequences of what we're already doing because we're living it. So were we to be able to do this, then we could relax our way of knowing and be able to be less reactive. Now, what does it mean to be less reactive? Does that mean I'd be indifferent and not caring? No. If I were less reactive, I could be more responsive. Okay. Our responsibility is our ability to respond. We could respond with more care, more love, more compassion, and we don't even have to try. More open settings naturally reveal more space, more light, more caring, more love, more equanimity, more peace. All the things we're trying to cultivate as the separate self sits on a pillow and says, I want to be more compassionate, I want to be more loving, I want to be... It's not that way. That self is not going to do it. How many of you already know that? Okay, so what we want to do is to relax the self, to dilate that particular aperture setting, or to open that way of knowing, so that more light, more awareness, more freedom can naturally arise. And we'll play with that. We'll play with that. And let this be lighthearted in terms of our, we're not going to work at this. We're going to play with it. We're going to consider it. We're going to recognize that this is a possibility, that this could be another way of knowing. And as we know another way, what we know changes. What we know is a consequence of how we know it. We can't continue to know in the same way and know something different. And that's at the root and at the core of this conversation.